No, we don't need more sleep. It's our souls that are tired, not our bodies. We need nature. We need magic. We need adventure. We need freedom. We need truth. We need stillness. We don't need more sleep. We need to wake up and live. Thank you, Brookhampton.
We're wrapping up the series on rest tonight, and mostly what I want to do is sort of refresh and review a couple of kind of big ideas of the series and set up this significant communal practice of rest, which will be at the Springs next week, the day we'll spend together. Once again, please don't come here at 5. You're going to be very disappointed. We're going to be at the Springs at 10 a.m., and we'll be there until we figure out how to rest. So it's going to be a while. They will kick us out. That's right. The park does close. Yes, we will. We'll figure it out. We'll work really hard. Or if you're like, you know what, I just want to get ejected from the park, you can find a manatee and touch it. They'll be happy to take you away. So I want to summarize and draw this together with a word that we haven't encountered this summer. I guess actually technically we've encountered it, but it's just another word for rest. It's sort of rest by another name. We've talked a lot about Sabbath. This comes out of the Hebrew tradition. And this word comes from the same sort of orbit as Sabbath. It shows up in the creation stories where we get the 6-in-1 rhythm of creation and rest. And then it also shows up in the Exodus stories where it ties to Sabbath. But this word is a little different. There's some nuance from Sabbath. The word is menuha, which is fun to say if you want to say that. Menuha? Yeah. You got it wrong, but good try. Before we get to that, I want to actually pick up where Katie left off this last week. She did a super cool teaching on the Hebrew process of becoming a rabbi. So this sort of awesome reflection on a yoke or an interpretation of the law or the Bible, and what it means to practice that way of life and extend community. We ended last week with the prayers of the people, to practice what it means to extend community in such a way that it eases difficulty and lightens burdens. And if you were here in the room, you felt that. That was a tangible thing that occurred last week. And so Katie last week briefly touched on this in passing, and I want to circle back just for a second because I think that's sort of ties into Menuha. The kids in the sort of Hebrew world would have to make it through 3 levels of Hebrew school, approximately 5 years each, memorizing over the course of those 5 years the entire Hebrew Bible. They would then apprentice with a rabbi, and the kids that were the best of the best would continue to go on to each successive level. The ones who didn't make it, who were not the best of the best, or in other words, who were not able to earn it, were undeserving of becoming rabbis, they went to ply their family trade. They would be something like fishermen, for example. Fishermen were not rabbis. Tax collectors were not rabbis. Carpenters were not rabbis. Sex workers were not rabbis. They weren't the best of the best. They were not good enough. They had not earned it. And so they didn't get to follow a rabbi. So imagine the scandal when Jesus walking down the beach with his luscious, long blonde hair and white skin. Yeah, baby blue. They're almost white. They're so blue. Imagine him walking down the beach and saying to some fishermen who had not made it, who were not good enough, him saying this classic rabbinic phrase, "Come follow me," which is what a rabbi would say to these Hebrew school kids when they were good enough to become a rabbi. He says it to fishermen who clearly didn't make it. But here, Jesus, without their ability to make it through this rigorous vetting process, comes up on some random blue-collar Hebrew school dropouts and says, "You're good enough. You belong. Come follow me." This is insanely counterintuitive. This is an affirmation not of their faith in him, but of his faith in them. That they can do what he does, that they can understand and live his yoke, that they can follow him. And so we see this play out throughout his brief ministry. In the same way he calls disciples outside of the known and accepted systems and processes, he opens every dinner table he's at to people he was not supposed to eat with. He engages in conversations with people he was not supposed to relate to. He touches people physically people who were unclean that he was not supposed to make contact with. And so from the calling of the disciples to healing to this radically inclusive meal practice, Jesus describes or displays what can only be described as unconditional welcome, unconditional hospitality, unconditional belonging. Keep that in mind. Menuha comes first, I think, from the passage in the Ten Commandments. This may sound familiar. In Exodus 20, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, work 6 days. On the seventh, don't do any work, cease from working. Why? Because God created the world, the earth and the seas and everything in them. Creation took 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. Therefore, God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. This word rest is nuah. That's the root of the word menuha. Now, this is where, for me, it blows my mind. It's probably just that I'm a super nerd. But in the story of the flood, right? Noah's Ark, you've heard this. This is the genocide of God. We'll come back to that some other time. God kills the world. When the ark comes to rest, right? The waters come, everybody dies, the waters subside, and the ark comes to rest. That's that same word, nuah. Now, I want to point this out, and this is the whole sermon. If you don't get anything else, this was like my epiphany this week. The ark doesn't cease working because the ark doesn't have a job. The ark is not sleep deprived. The ark is not working 80-hour weeks. The ark comes to rest. The ark settles. Everyone take a huge breath. You're not following me. I'm saying, like, let your ass actually settle. Like, sit down. Let the chair hold you. Deep breath. I wish I wasn't standing. This would be so much easier. So in one sense, nuah is rest, but the specific of rest here is it settled. It didn't stop working, but it settled. This is also just a fun side fact. This is a play on words because the Hebrew word for rest is nuah, and it's when it shows up in the story of Noah's Ark, nuah, Noah, so there's this really cool thing going on. The authors are brilliant. So there's this connection in the text between this cosmic understanding that the divine rests, that our call is to rest so that we can mirror the nature of the divine, the universe, the cosmos. This is where we started the whole series. Rest isn't like a hip fad this year, a culturally hot practice, a new method of productivity or self-help or personal enlightenment. Rest is ingrained at the deepest levels of all we know about all we know. Rest is a part of that. God resting is about the nature of reality. Rest is a part of how things are. Something central to creation itself about rest, about menuha. I said these authors are brilliant. I want to show you a couple more things. The Bible opens with this creation poem because sometimes literal language isn't enough to capture this sort of beauty, profound mystery. Literal language is too small. We call this theopoetics. Genesis 1 and 2 is this creation poem, and it builds, and it reaches its pinnacle in the seventh day, in menuha. And it specifies the seventh day is different from all the other days because there isn't creating a world. The divine rest, or we might say the absence of creation, creates rest. And so there's this debate among the rabbis, does God create rest, or does God ceasing from work, just the absence of creation, is in itself creative? Maybe the absence of work in and of itself is a creative act. So the lack of work, the lack of creation actually is creative. Let that sort of cook your noodle for a little while. Caitlin mentioned this a few weeks ago in her sermon on Sabbath. Creation is incomplete without rest because there is no fullness of life without celebration. I think this is from C.S. Lewis. I heard this years ago. That if you have the very best meal you've ever had in your life, whatever that is, picture your favorite meal. The joy in that meal is incomplete if you are unable to share that with someone. If you can't call your friend, if you can't Facebook message the foodies group and go, oh my God, we've got to go try this, right? If you experience something that is like the best, it's incomplete unless you're able to savor it, to settle, to share that, to enjoy it. There's the work, the creating, organizing, designing, executing, acting, adjusting, producing, but without the pause for enjoyment, without the celebration, without the party, without the rest, what I want to call tonight the deep exhale of contentment. as one reflects from a distance, the enjoyment that is only experienced from the position of not being in the work. Without this, there is not the fullness of creation. Because you can work and work and work and work and work, but if you can never step back and have that deep exhale of contentment, the creation itself is actually incomplete. So for thousands of years, these Hebrew poets insisted there's something about the nature of the universe itself that flows from and is propelled by, is inspired by, is the engine and the culmination of rest. Not only the Sabbath, the ceasing of literal work, but the menuha, the deep, contented enjoyment of the work being done, the deep exhale of contentment. We're going to come back to that because I know we live in a culture where the work is never done, so let's put a pin in that for a second. Now remember, I keep saying these authors are brilliant. Last example, the numerical structure of these early poems is filled with sevens, right? Sevens, 7-letter words or phrases divisible by 7. So Genesis 1 is 7 words, which is 28 letters, 4 times 7. The first 3 words of the Bible, in the beginning God created, that's 14 letters, 7 times 2. Verse 2 is 14 words, 7 times 2. The section on Sabbath is 35 words, 5 times 7. Earth occurs 21 times, 3 times 7. God occurs 35 times, 5 times 7. Heaven 21 times, 3 times 7. The phrase "it was so" 7 times. The phrase "it was good" 7 times. In the Hebrew Bible, the number 7 occurs 287 times. That's 7 times 41. So when someone says, is the creation story literal? No, absolutely not. It was never meant to be because we read in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the waters, and God said, let there be light. The original hearers were hearing 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, menuha, 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 menuha. Because here, the 7 reflects the fullness and vitality of creation. And more, this is written for and spoken to former Hebrew slaves whose identity was work. Their value was production. Whether or not they measured up to anything was based on how many bricks they made and how efficiently they made them. For the people who first heard this, who needed to hear this word, menuha, the work was never done, even when it was done. So what needs to be spoken to them about what is most true about reality? Menuha, 7, completion, fulfillment, rest, the deep sigh of contentment, the step back for celebration, the affirmation that even just for this moment, things are complete. Sometimes the work is done, even when it's not done. Sometimes the work must be done, even when it's not done. So menuha, this is not just ceasing work, but a sort of soul contentment, a spiritual contentment, choosing for the work to be done, even when it's not done. Or maybe it's where we ended last week. Not that you'll get time off, but that you will find rest for your souls. Jim sent me this quote this week that we read. Brilliant. We don't need more sleep. It's our souls that are tired. It's not just about another day off or a couple hours off. It's about addressing something deeper. And I think this is the difference between Sabbath, which we've spent a lot of time covering, and menuha, between ceasing striving, that's the practice, and deeply resting, which is the experience. So Sabbath is the external practice. Menuha is the internal reality, the internal experience, that deep sigh, the surrender of the soul. So I gave this example, I think, a couple times during the series. I struggle to rest if I haven't gotten it all done. This goes back to when I was in elementary school. If I get an assignment, it's not due for 3 months, I get it done in the first week and a half because I don't want it hanging over my head because I know I can't settle. I can't rest until it's done. The deception became, over time, if I get it done, then I'll be able to truly rest. The problem is this: Sabbath practices the work is done even if it's not done. Menuha experiences the work is done even if it's not done. And we can legalize our way into Sabbath and go, I'm going to force myself to take these hours off. I'm going to take this day off once a week. I'm going to go on vacation this many times a week. That's great. And I think a lot of times that's what creates the space for the experience, but they're not the same thing. The external is outside in. That's the feeling that I was looking for. If I finish the work, then the rest will come from the achievement. From the outside in, I got that done, and then maybe something will get in here. Maybe I'll finally feel that feeling if I get all the work done. Menuha is the opposite. It says there's a way to menuha, to rest, to settle, to choose that same contentment, that celebration, the deep exhale of the soul in the inner life, as if the work is done, as if I finished the project that it's hanging over my head, as if I finally achieved whatever the thing is, as if the work is done even when the work is not done. That's what this menuha is trying to get at. And this is deeply personal, but as Kayleen pointed out, this is also political. Because remember, the prophets say, why were you conquered? Why were you dragged off into exile? Why do you continue as a people to fail and fall and get hauled away by people who conquer you? Because you didn't rest. Right? You didn't follow the law, which means you didn't let the poor and the land and the workers and the oppressed, you didn't let them rest. And this is not just for thousands and thousands of years ago. We know this to be true as well. I think if we look at the state of the world that we're living in, if we don't ever unplug and turn off and walk away from the buzz and the hit and the ping of adrenaline, we lose more than personal contentment, right? The problems with the world at this point are not just about the fact that I'm not personally content. The prophets say, because you had no menuha, not just you, but the way you failed to practice that on behalf of the people around you, your whole culture, politically, socially, spiritually, fell apart. And that continues to happen. So creating a world is a thing, but not creating a world is also a thing. Profound, right? Going to work is a thing. Not going to work is also a thing. In music, right? The music is fire tonight. I'm not just saying that because I love the drums. The notes are there, right? In music, there's notes, but there's also rest. They're both a thing. The cool thing is, without the rest, it isn't music. It's just noise. The rest, the space between the notes, are just as real as the notes on either side. And this is true in physical space as well, right? Right here, this is a column. And over here, here's another column. The columns are real. But so is the space between the columns. It isn't anything, but it is. It's a thing. It's not a thing, but it's a thing. Because it frames the space in such a way that we're drawn into it, we're drawn through it, or in many cases, we're drawn to occupy the negative space. And I think the idea of rest works in the same way, that if we can make space, we can create negative space by ceasing work, which is the practice of Sabbath. If we can create negative space between the columns, between the work, by practicing Sabbath, I will cease work. The hope is that that will draw us into and draw us through and invite us to occupy the space between the work and actually experience menuha. So there's the practice that creates the space, and then there's the experience of the space. But our reality is all work, all noise, all columns, also called walls. We go and go and go and go and go and go until we collapse. Going, achieving, providing, answering emails, driving kids places, buzz, push, pull, grind, as if going is the only reality. But in the creation story, the rest, the menuha, is just as real as the creation. And you get the understanding, because it's the pinnacle of the creative work of God, that it is as if not more vital to creation, that without it we don't have the fullness of life. Have you heard anyone say, or maybe you yourself have said, man, we just got up late. We slept late for whatever reason. The kids slept late, and we were going to make pancakes, but screw that. We drove through Dunkin' Donuts, and we just sat around. We didn't do anything. We watched TV all day. We never got out of our PJs. we were just lazy. What? We were just lazy. As if the binaries that we live with are workaholism and lazy. Rather than saying, all week, I did the incredibly powerful, good, sacred work of vocation. I pushed, I hustled, but today we did the most important thing, menuha. Today we rested. We weren't lazy, we chose to inhabit the space between the work. Today, like a boat in an outgoing tide coming to rest on the ground, today the tide of our work subsided. Even though it wasn't done, parentheses, the tide of our work subsided. And we just, instead of lazy, we just settled. The tide of our work subsided, it created space, and we chose to inhabit that space. We just settled. We didn't go to work, but more than that, we found rest for our souls. We settled into the ground of being. Menuha, work is done even when it isn't done. I wrote that this morning. It must have been like maybe 11 a.m. And right when I wrote this line, this is almost the end of the sermon because of this. I wrote this line, and June and Huck run in the room. They said, Daddy, we're pretending to be on a boat with a blanket, and the floor is water, and we're surfing on pillows, and it's summer vacation, so everybody gets to play. And then there was a long pause, and they both looked down at the same time. And they both said, Daddy, we wish you could be done with your work so you could come play. And I closed my computer. And that was the end of the prep for the sermon. But don't worry, there's more. That got me thinking about what it looks like for a kid to grow up with the message of menuha. You're good. You're okay. You're supposed to be here. You're valued. We love you. And you can play because you belong unconditionally. But that's not the message most of us grew up with. That's not the message I grew up with. My fear is that there are days where that's not the message my kids grow up with when I don't close the computer. Because many of us, we grew up with and we continue to hear from our job and our work and maybe our spouses and the groups we associate with, it's 7 days of striving. Because I got to work and I got to prove and I got to earn and I got to perform. Instead of a settled, accepted, unconditional belonging. And think about this, how much better is the work? How much better is the work? Not that it's a means to an end, but how much better is the work? The giving and serving and organizing and designing, the mothering and fathering and healing and teaching, when it flows from that kind of rest, that kind of exhale of contentment, that kind of unconditional belonging. It's like the disciples Jesus calls, who not only could they not earn it, they'd already failed to earn it. They were already past that on the other side. Like the people who he healed and touched, who were already unacceptable. There wasn't any way they were going to become acceptable. Like the people he ate with who didn't measure up. But each of these people, each of these groups were offered belonging. They were allowed in the simple inclusion of a meal or a touch or a conversation. They were invited to rest in themselves. They could show up as they were. And they belonged. And doesn't that kind of belonging generate a different, deeper kind of rest? The kind of rest that isn't just about the job being done. It's not just about whether or not you're going to work or not going to work, but the kind of rest that addresses the way that we try to earn our humanity, the way that we strive to fit in, the work of measuring up and being good enough and lovable enough and deserving enough. Menuha is a depth of rest that comes from unconditional belonging and calls us to let the tide of striving go. so we can settle into the ground of belonging, so we can rest on that. It's no surprise then that we come to a table that for thousands of years has been shared by people who needed that message of belonging, that experience of rest for their souls, so desperately, as we do now. It's no surprise that we come to a table of unconditional belonging. And so we say every week it's open to all people. There is not a thing that can exclude. A table where Jesus' body and blood identify us with the fullness of the human experience. The fullness of the human experience. The deep insecurity that drives us to the deception that we have to earn our human dignity. The deception that drives us to try to earn belonging. But at the same time, we break that and we pour that out as a way of making an unconditional welcome, as a way of setting a table of unconditional hospitality, as a way of extending unconditional belonging to all people, as a way of practicing menuha, that anyone from anywhere in earshot, online, as far away as you are, that we want to make sure everyone knows that there's a table set every week that will allow you, if nothing else, to rest in who you are, that you're okay, that you belong without condition. It's a table of rest, a table of settling, a table of belonging. As always, it's a table that's set for us, but it's open to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.